Hi friends, welcome to Georgia Jake. America just turned 250 a few days ago, and in the spirit of independence, let's discuss a question that I've had recently. Is the National Guard the militia? Many gun control proponents have argued that the National Guard is the militia, and the Second Amendment just protects the National Guard's right to bear arms. However, many firearms rights proponents have argued that the National Guard is not the militia, and the Second Amendment protects the individual right to bear arms. I've also agreed with the latter, but a recent reading of the Federalist papers made me wonder if both sides are partially correct. I found even more evidence supporting an individual right, but something made me question what the militia is and how it was supposed to be intended.
A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
First, we'll briefly summarize the initial evidence I've stated in previous videos about why the Second Amendment protects an individual right separate from the militia. First, a well-regulated militia being necessary is a prefatory clause explaining why the individual right to bear arms is necessary. Throughout the rest of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution as a whole, the people refers to an individual right. Why would the exception be in the second? The Supreme Court case District of Columbia v. Heller also reinforced the individual right. During my rereading of the Federalist Papers, I found additional evidence that all of the founders believed in an individual right to bear arms. But what they disagreed on vehemently was how to organize the militia, and if a standing army was necessary, or if a navy was sufficient.
Before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed. As they are in almost every kingdom of Europe, the supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword, because a whole body of people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops.
This is where my opinion began to shift slightly. Now, I explained in the past how regulated, according to the 1824 Webster's Dictionary, meant participle, passive, adjusted by rule, method or forms, put in good order, subjected to rules or restrictions. I stated that this does not allow government laws to limit the individual right, which I still believe. After all, the militia leaders could confiscate arms to be divided out at their discretion. There would be no need for the amendment to begin with. However, I realized that although Congress did not have the power to confiscate personal arms, it did have the power to make sure the militia was properly trained and equipped. Early colonies even had registries and inspections of individual arms to make sure they were up to standard. Now wait a minute, I know that sounds like gun control at first, but it's actually the opposite. That would be like the ATF showing up to your house to make sure that you did have a functional RPG and machine gun. Even Jefferson agreed with the uniform state of the militia, even though he despised any sort of standing army.
For a people who are free and who mean to remain so, a well-organized and armed militia is their best security. It is therefore incumbent on us at every meeting to revise the condition of the militia, and to ask ourselves if it is prepared to repel a powerful enemy at every point of our territories exposed to invasion. Congress alone has power to produce a uniform state of preparation.
What was intriguing to me is even the founders who hated standing armies believed that the militia could be called upon by Congress. However, many like George Mason thought the militia clause in the Constitution was too vague. The clause states, Congress shall have the power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Now, George Mason was quoted saying at the Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1788, I ask, who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people except a few public officers. I've quoted this before, but without the context of the rest, where he says, but I cannot say who will be the militia of the future day. If that paper around that table gets no alteration, the Constitution, the militia of the future day may not consist of all classes, high and low and rich and poor, but they may be confined to the lower and middle classes of the people, granting exclusion to the higher classes of the people. Now, to us, it seems a little backwards because it seems like he's saying, wait a minute, he's worried that the poor people are going to be the only people with guns and the rich people won't. It's kind of the opposite of what happens in our world right now, where it's usually the rich people like Taylor Swift that say they support gun control and then have snipers at their wedding. But no, I don't think that's what he's talking about here. He wasn't worried about the individual right being misconstrued, but that the duty of the militia would be changed to exclude the higher classes. Did this mean he believed in a draft? Well, no, not in the way that it was used in Vietnam. With his opposition of a standing army, founders like Mason believed that Congress had the power to call forth the militia only in local service within their state and or neighboring state.
This Bannerman will rally to his cause.
The key here is to repel invasions or suppress insurrections. One of the biggest issues with the Vietnam draft was that if you could afford to go to college or had a family with connections, you would be exempt. That's what this unfortunate son is about. It was also a draft into the federal standing army to fight an unpopular foreign war. If Congress or Lyndon B. Johnson had to send their own sons to fight, they probably would not have started the war. Also, without a standing army, the only time the militia would even need to be called upon would be an invasion. To the framers, the Armies Clause allowed Congress to finance a volunteer army, not conscript one. If the nation was invaded, Congress could require, say, 5,000 soldiers from a state militia. It would be up to the states to ask for volunteers, or even draft them. But pressing a citizen directly into a federal expeditionary force would have looked to Jefferson exactly like the tyranny of the British Empire. It wasn't until 1918 that the Supreme Court ruled the Armies Clause allowed for a draft. But this was likely due to the fear of World War I rather than objective assessment. So I've changed my opinion slightly on the draft, but only slightly. I don't believe in a federal draft for an offensive war. Instead, I do believe it is the duty of every man to fight in their own state militia should we be invaded, regardless of privilege. But honestly, if the draft was limited to invasion, you wouldn't even need it. It's not hard to convince an American to defend their own home. Wolverines! Now, we discussed what calling forth the militia looks like, but what about Congress's other power for the militia?
To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers, and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress.
As I read Federalist 29, I learned Hamilton believed it impractical for Congress to discipline the entire militia. He believes soldiering takes time and practice, and forcing everyone to leave their jobs to train adequately would destroy the economy. Around this time, I also learned from experience how difficult it was to become as proficient as a regular soldier as a militiaman volunteer. The militia system during the colonial period consisted of volunteers who had families, full-time jobs, and bought and provided their own gear. Modern army equipment is expensive and complex and requires much more time dedicated to learning how to use them. I used to volunteer in my state defense force, a voluntary auxiliary to the National Guard. We were an unarmed disaster response force that followed an army structure. We also had to provide our own gear, and even without weapons, it was still super expensive. Unarmed training alone was extremely time-consuming, and I realized how impractical it was for everyone to do. Being away from my wife and job, but without pay, it was no longer worth it for me. I loved it, and it gave me a ton of confidence that I wish I had been in the National Guard during college or spent a few years on active duty first. So, what's the solution?
The project of disciplining all the militia of the United States is as futile as it would be injurious if it were capable of being carried into execution.
Continuing in Federalist 29, Hamilton proposed an answer to this dilemma, a, quote, special corps of the militia who could spend additional time training understate officers with a congressional mandate. This idea sounded good to Ohio Congressman Charles Dick, who convinced Congress to fund the militia in exchange for federal service. The Militia Act of 1903 passed and established two classes of militia: the organized militia, consisting of the National Guard and Naval Militia, and the unorganized militia, comprising the reserve militia, every able-bodied man of at least 17 and under 45 years of age. Jefferson believed a, quote, select militia, quote, would lead to a standing army masquerading as a militia. However, Hamilton believed that reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of the officers, quote, and the private ownership of weapons was enough to prevent this force being used tyrannically. Congress actually cites the Armies Clause when federalizing them. So it seems Congress considers a militia when it suits them, and a standing army when it suits them. But interestingly enough, when Jefferson became president, he began to see Hamilton's reasoning in a special corps. In 1807, with the Napoleonic Wars looming, Jefferson admitted most of the militia was useless at a distance. He classified 18 to 26-year-olds as the target for additional training. If America was invaded, this select group of the militia could be called up for a year of a defensive service. He also convinced Congress to pass the 1808 Militia Act, funding the state militias through equipment procurement. But, even with the threat of war, neither he nor Hamilton believed the militia could be foreign deployed. They also believed if the militia was called into federal service, the governors would report to the president only and not have federal officers in the chain of command. Originally, the National Guard did follow this, but something changed. In 1915, President Woodrow Wilson proposed the Continental Army Plan. This would have replaced the National Guard's federal funding with the massive 400,000-man Federal Reserve Force. Many governors and congressmen viewed it as a dangerous federal power grab. With weapon technology increasing so rapidly, smaller states relied on their federal funding in order to keep up. The National Defense Act of 1916 was meant to be a compromise. The federal government co-opting the militias via dual enlistment gave them the trained troops it wanted, but allowed the states to keep their governors in command during peacetime. This was the militia's last hope. However, it finally died, in my opinion, when foreign deployments of the National Guard were upheld in the 1990 Supreme Court case Perpick v. Department of Defense. Jefferson and Mason's worst fears were realized. Now, wait a minute. What about the state defense forces we discussed earlier? Are they the new militia then? They can't be federalized. Well, they did start out as a hopeful replacement around the same time. In World War I, the Home Guards were created to protect the states while the newly federalized National Guards could be used for war. Unfortunately, most of the state defense forces that were their successors are completely unarmed now. Their governors consider arming them unnecessary and expensive when they have access to a federally funded National Guard. Looks like Mason was right again.
That army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people while there is a large body of citizens, little if at all, inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. This appears to me the only substitute that can be devised for a standing army, and the best possible security against it if it should exist.
We've established that the founders disagreed over the militia's organization. Hamilton and the Federalists focused on professionalism and constitutional loyalty over state division for national defense. Thomas Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists were focused on decentralization and preventing tyranny from within. However, the founders also disagreed over a standing army as well. Jefferson thought a Navy, Marine Corps, and militia was enough. Hamilton believed in a border army large enough to halt and hold an invading army at the border while the militia mobilized. He defended the Armies Clause, believing requiring Congress to vote on the funding every 2 years would prevent the president from tyrannically using it. To reconcile the anti-federalist fears over a changing definition of the militia and the power of a standing army, however, the Second Amendment was drafted to protect the individual right to bear arms on par with any standing armies. In this case, I agree with the Federalists. With how fast soldiers can fly across the ocean now, there needs to be some sort of standing forces to give the militia time to mobilize, and Congress has continually funded the military. In the 1700s, it took months for an army to reach our shores, resulting in Jefferson believing a Navy and the Marine Corps was sufficient warning. But now it takes airborne soldiers just a few hours, ICBMs 30 minutes, and cyber attacks 30 seconds to deploy. I believe Hamilton would support our current military size and National Guard structure, but he would probably be concerned with its interventionist tendencies. Jefferson would maybe concede the need for the Air Force and Space Force, since they function more like a Navy than a ground force. His biggest concern was soldiers kicking in doors, and neither of those branches have soldiers. However, he would definitely want to prevent the National Guard from being foreign deployed and downsize the Army, which he actually did. When he was president, he decreased the Army from 5,400 to 3,200 soldiers. But in modern times, I don't think even Jefferson would agree or argue to disband the federal military entirely.
The Congress shall have power to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years.
So, is the National Guard the militia? Well, no, I don't think so. All of the founders agreed that the militia is everyone, which not only means an individual right to arms, but also an individual duty to defend the nation during invasions, regardless of class. However, what they disagreed on was when it could be called upon and how it was organized. Jefferson would argue Hamilton's special corps of the militia is just a standing army with state officers. George Mason, another anti-federalist, was also concerned that, quote, should the national government wish to render the militia useless, they may neglect them and let them perish, in order to have a pretense of establishing a standing army. Quote, the fact that National Guardsmen cannot keep their personal weapons off base, the state guards are unarmed, and the civilians cannot have military weapons at all, lends me to say that the militia is currently corrupted. That being said, with today's threats, I do believe we need some standing forces, but with less foreign intervention. and a restoration of arms to the rest of the militia. The National Guard has been very effective in its dual role, and like Hamilton believed, I think it would side with the states if the federal government became tyrannical. Title X has only been invoked a few times, and the Supreme Court has struck down many of their recent deployments. However, I believe it could easily become Hamilton's special corps of the militia if it wasn't able to be foreign deployed. But in closing, regardless of what the militia is, your right to bear arms is not dependent on your service in it.
The Congress shall have power to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years.
So what should we do now? Well, first is to continually petition Congress and pray that they properly restore the militia in a few ways. First is to restore the individual right to military weapons regardless of militia service. The second is to replace the federal selective service with a state militia roster, preventing a full draft but allowing the states to call upon the citizens if needed. If we're invaded, they just can't be foreign deployed. The third is to rearm the state defense forces back into an organization of the militia. They can continue to focus on disaster relief, just with the added ability to provide force protection in those areas. The states can't fund fighter jets on their own, but I don't think they need them. If we get invaded, the militia is far better off fighting back asymmetrically anyway. If we restore the individual right, the SDFs don't even need the weapons, they can just ask Bob to bring his personal RPG to drill. Lastly, as much as I'd like to prevent the National Guard from being foreign deployed, the Army has relied on them as reserve in almost every major conflict far more often than drafts. Also, many National Guardsmen take pride in their ability to help the state and be deployed. They'd also likely lose their federal funding, and the states would lose a great resource. Even though they're not a militia anymore in my mind, they would still likely side with the states if the federal government became tyrannical anyway. So thank you for watching, and let me know in the comments if you would be interested in future videos talking about what we can do as the unorganized militia right now. And as always, remember, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed.
Wolverine!